Bada big green stride. Today's Tom Sawyer, big green guy. Hi everyone, it is Tuesday, I am Tuesday, and today I'm gonna learn you a little bit of film history by rambling about four-ish adaptations of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain in a vaguely chronological manner. Then, I'm gonna criticize some of these adaptations. Then, the video will be over. Also, spoiler alert for a book written in the 1870s, I guess. Now, you might be wondering, Tuesday, I thought this was about movie adaptations. Why'd you just put up a book spoiler warning? If that's the case, hi, welcome to the channel. I promise I'm mostly talking about movies today, but I just wanted to tell you that I like books, and I tend to talk about them. So if y'all are into that type of thing, please consider subscribing or even commenting on the video. I read all of them and respond to most, so if you'd like a random stranger to acknowledge you on the internet, I am more than happy to fill that niche. On to the video. For those of you who didn't know, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain was published in 1876 and is widely considered to be one of the greatest American novels ever written. It follows the story of one Tom Sawyer as he goes on a series of adventures, each with a steadily increasing level of mortal danger involved. You all know this story, or at least the broad strokes of it. Be it through watching that one adaptation in elementary school on VHS because the school had bought it in the 90s but ran out of money to get anything else, so they just kept playing it over and over and over again, or reading the abridged classics version in middle school, or sparknoting it in your sophomore American Lit class. I like to think people have a general idea of what Tom Sawyer is. What? No. I'll get to that in a second. Mark Twain's novel isn't about being young. It is a reminiscence of youth from the perspective of someone grown. While certainly comprehensible to young audiences, it doesn't take on the typical trappings of a children's story. Rather, the book is meant to remind adults what it felt like to grow up. Tom starts the narrative in a state of innocence, focused on fishing, fighting, playing hooky, pretending to be a pirate, and other stereotypically boyish pursuits. The only thing he has to worry about is his tattletale brother, Sid, a switch from his teacher, or getting clouded by Aunt Polly. And then he straight up witnesses a murder. I don't remember the first time I interacted with this story. It's always just been something I've known about, but I can imagine that for the first-time reader, the graveyard scene can be pretty jarring. The death of Doc Robinson is the first point in which we as an audience are able to see the background malaise of darkness throughout this story rear its head. Up until this point, the tale of Tom Sawyer has been hysterical but fluffy, a life of low-stakes mischief and general tomfoolery. Sure, references are made to Huck's abysmal home life and subsequent lack thereof, and slavery is present throughout, but these weren't the focus of the narrative. Why would they be? Tom, in his youthful ignorance, has no reason to focus on them, so the narrator doesn't either. The world, after all, is about grand adventures and collecting trinkets and falling in love with multiple of your female classmates. Nothing of real consequence ever actually happens. Of course, this isn't true. Anybody who's grown is able to say that with confidence, but again, this is a book about what it's like to grow up. Sometimes bad things happen, and the first time they do, none of us are adequately prepared to deal with them. All we can do with confidence is have our perspectives shifted. Tom spends the rest of the novel becoming more engrossed in and more aware of the darkness in the world around him, physically manifested in the cave sequence in which Becky almost dies of exposure. The comedy is still present. The joys of being young and carefree still exist, but they are forced to exist in tandem with some of the harsher aspects of reality. Tom, while still being childish, must over the course of the novel recontextualize his place in the world and his relationships with the people around him. In a word, Tom must grow up, and in doing so remind the reader what that process felt like. That's really hard to depict on screen though, so most of the movie adaptations just turned this into a love story. We see this happening in the first known iteration of Mark Twain's book ever to be put on the silver screen, Tom Sawyer, a movie which came out 11 months before the end of World War I. While this film is relatively faithful in a truncated way to the source material, it only covers the first half of the book, excluding the graveyard scene. As a result of this, the movie focuses more heavily on the gags. If I were to guess, I'd say that producers needed to find something story-wise to latch onto in this first half of the novel. While the entire book feels rather serialized, this is more apparent early on when Twain is still setting up characters and setting. Since the real meat of the tale kicks off in the graveyard, anything before that can be seen as an appetizer, and it's hard to make a cohesive narrative out of an appetizer. So we hit the love angle. This needs to be wrapped up in about 60 minutes, and the Tom-Becky stuff holds the most straightforward story beats. Heck, even Tom running away to Jackson's Island is explained by Becky spurning him. All in all, while I don't necessarily enjoy some of the decisions producers made here, and they led to more problems down the road, I do understand why they made them. 4 out of 10. On top of that, most of my issues with the story get corrected in the sequel. No, Huck and Tom, which came out a year later. Okay guys, I fully intended to talk about this movie here in depth, but I can't find it. It's not lost, per se. From what I can tell, it's preserved by a French film society named Archive du Film du CNC in the Bois d'Arcy archive. Now, I don't speak French, and I doubt they would give some rando on the internet access to their archive anyway, so watching it in full was kind of a non-starter. I did find a clip show produced by Paramount to celebrate their 20th anniversary called The House That Shadows Built, but the only part of Huck and Tom in there is this 3-second video clip. So that was a dead end too. If by any chance one of y'all knows where to find the full thing, please let me know, because I really want to watch it. Otherwise, I'm just gonna move on with the video. Overall, this movie is pretty good. It's a mostly faithful adaptation of Twain's book, and the acting holds up surprisingly well. Unlike a later entry in this list, the child actors are surprisingly bearable. The reason for this lies in the fact that this movie still has that golden age Hollywood acting style where everything still feels super affected, as if they're still trying to imitate popular theatrical productions. After all, when everyone talks and moves like they're trying to play to the blind, deaf grandma at the back of the theater, the kids playing Tom, Huck, and Becky seeming wooden becomes less of an issue. This does, however, lead to one of the biggest problems I have with this film, which is that Aunt Polly seems unnecessarily mean, despite enacting some of the exact same gags Mark Twain puts into the novel. Let me explain. There's a scene in the novel where Sid knocks over a piece of china when everyone is sitting down for supper. Tom feels elated at the prospect of his half-brother getting himself punished for once, only to be greeted by a swift slap from Aunt Polly. Cousin Mary comes to the rescue, explaining how it was Sid who'd broken the china, only for Aunt Polly to respond by saying Tom's slap was for something he'd done that she just didn't know about yet. The whole scene is set up like a joke, including a misdirect, ending with Aunt Polly's rebuttal as the punchline, and it only works on paper. Humans, after all, are highly visual creatures, so despite the vividness of an author's portrayal, reading about something is always going to be more ethereal than actually witnessing it firsthand. This disconnect between what is and what is described creates a space for the imagination to take hold, and any writer worth their salt will be able to capitalize on this to great dramatic, horrific, or comedic effect. Reading about Tom getting whooped allows the scene to exist as a form of slapstick in our minds. The character Tom Sawyer is not rent of flesh and blood, so with the right type of presentation, his unjust suffering can take on an air of slapstick humor, which is lost when adapting the scene onto the big screen, especially when the characters are portrayed by actual children. Tommy Kelly was 13 years old when this movie was filmed, but the way it's shot makes him look younger. So, when the audience watches this child get unjustly punished, a different type of guttural reaction is likely to occur. The presentation makes Aunt Polly seem cruel, and this perception haunts most of her performance. Aside from that, this movie is pretty solid if you're interested, though I doubt I'll ever watch it again. I'd say 4 out of 10. Worth your time? Barely. Outside of the cave sequence, which is what it's famous for, the whole thing plays like a classic mid-budget western. Enjoyable, but forgettable, and nowhere near as interesting to examine as the musicals.
Bullseye.
When I was a kid, there were two musical adaptations of Tom Sawyer that I would watch repeatedly. One from 1973 and one from 2000. I'm gonna start with the latter one. This was my favorite Tom Sawyer adaptation as a kid. There were times in my childhood when I would watch this multiple times per week. To be honest, I was worried about re-examining this one because, as with so many things we enjoy in our childhood, I was worried I would look back at it and find out this movie that I had loved so dearly was actually bad. I got a couple of friends together to watch it with me so I'd have someone to riff on it with, and was pleasantly surprised. This weird direct-to-video cartoon holds up pretty well, so much so that I was able to ignore the cheesy romance stuff. Like, why is Don Knotts in this? Why are Waylon Jennings, Betty White, and Hank Williams Jr. in this? Why did Charlie Daniels have a song in this? Why does the music slap? I have a general bone to pick with most musicals, which I won't get into here, but their ubiquity in the wider media landscape is hard to ignore. Hell, a book of goddamn fascist poetry got turned into one of the highest grossing musicals ever, so giving Mark Twain the old Broadway treatment was less of a question and more of an inevitability. On top of this, the disjointed structure of Twain's novel lends itself well to the musical format. The many adventures Tom goes on can easily be cordoned off into self-contained sections paired with catchy pop-esque show tunes and strung together by quick scenes filled with light, functional dialogue to move between set pieces.
Behold, 90% of musicals.
Turn up the tropes, tune down the satire, and you've got yourself a rootin' tootin' and most importantly, profitable musical endeavor. At least on paper. As I said, Tom Sawyer 2000 was a needlessly talent-filled direct-to-video cartoon made for children that flopped critically and has been shuffled off to the long-forgotten annals of Wikipedia reference articles. It deviates wildly from its source material in an attempt to streamline the story for younger audiences, a decision criticized by reviewers, and focuses heavily on the romance angle between Tom and Becky, a relationship that drives a good half of the narrative tension in the movie. It's cutesy and vapid, very deserving of its G rating despite some violent imagery, and almost completely unremarkable beyond the quirks of its cast and competency of its music. On the other hand, Tom Sawyer, the 1973 musical, was nominated for multiple Academy Awards and won the Golden Globe for Best Original Score. It was filmed on location in an actual historical town in Canada, hosts a full village's worth of cast members, chorus, and extras, and is partial towards dramatic wide shots and single, lonely tears running down characters' faces. On a technical level, this movie is outstanding. The score is well set with a decent pace of new material while effectively interweaving lyrical and melodic callbacks. The camera work is dynamic but grounded, willing to walk with the characters while not giving into the bombast of a mid-century movie musical. Even the acting is better than one would expect from the typical Broadway transition scene, so why is it that I like this so much better? Well, first of all, this kid cannot sing. And don't just take my word for it, hear it from his own damn mouth.
I'm generous. I mean, when's the last time you could slosh a bucket full of wash under my fence?
Now, granted, this wouldn't be so much of a problem in small doses, but when this is the voice that's supposed to carry your award-winning musical picture, you might find reason to be concerned. What's more is that none of the songs seem to have any weight to them. In the previous paragraph, I said this soundtrack introduces a lot of new material while still interweaving callbacks. What I didn't say was that this results in a large chunk of the movie sounding the same. You see, barring one song describing Becky's inner monologue, the music holds to this upbeat, folksy vibe, intercut with nostalgic harmonica and a decent bit of twang thrown in by people who obviously don't know how to use it. It sounds like what a New Yorker would think Southern folk ought to sound like, which is fine in points where it works. The River song f***ed me up as a kid. but it plays its hand too quickly to be able to effectively carry a feature-length film. And this is all before I talk about the story. I'm honestly livid about some of the choices they made regarding characters in this movie, but I'm only gonna focus on one thing because it happens to be right at the start of the film and is one of the ones that makes me the most mad. Y'all ready for it? Here you go. Huck's dad is dead. Who cares, right? I do. Because on top of Pap being dead, Muff says this about him.
Happy days they was when your pap was living. Oh, free-hearted man he was. Sing, he could sing like a meadowlark.
This is kind of getting into Huck Finn territory, so I'll discuss it more in depth in a future video, but in the books, Pap is a negligent, abusive drunk who essentially abandoned Huckleberry at an early age and intermittently disappears for months or years at a time. In a twisted way, Pap being gone is the better parenting option for Huck, because whenever Pap is home, his favorite pastimes are drinking and domestic violence. Nowhere in the source material is the character considered to be redeemable. Pitiable, yes, but not redeemable. So when Musical Muff claims Pap was the sweetest man he ever knew, anybody who is as invested in the source material as I am gets a sour taste in their mouth and enters into the movie with a combative and critical eye. In stark contrast to this, Tom Sawyer 2000 has literally none of the problems I just mentioned, down to the very basics of its presentation. Since it's a cartoon, we don't need children with questionable acting chops to carry the story. Instead, trained actors and voice actors are able to fill the roles. But what if one of the actors can't sing? Well, swap them out with a couple country stars for the musical numbers. And how about that music? Each song is written by a different combination of country stars, all with vastly different styles and preferences, leading to a rich tapestry of musical ideas to keep the audience engaged. Side note, the Sherman Brothers are legends in their own right. I just don't think they did a very good job here. What about Pap then? Huck's a fox who likes to fish. He doesn't need a familial explanation. Well, what about that sour taste around deviating from the source material that only crazies who like Mark Twain would care about? It's a children's cartoon where Tom Sawyer takes the form of a talking cat. You expect me not to like this? When it really came down to it, I had to stop watching this 3 times in order to get through it all. It felt that boring to revisit. Even the worst song on this track is a banger. On top of all this, on top of every reason I've given for liking the 2000 musical, for once, Joe isn't a gross racial stereotype. Wait, what's that sound? Ah! Please skip ahead here if you don't want to talk about, genocide. I have gone to great lengths to forgive Jim's portrayal in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and will continue to do so, probably in the sequel to this video. I can't extend that same olive branch to the portrayals of Joe. You see, in Huck Finn, Mark Twain spends most of the novel humanizing Jim, as the character works as a stand-in for the enslaved people all across America. Because of this tokenism, there are some neoliberal types who condemn Jim's portrayal as a racist caricature based solely on the optics of his presentation. They use a smooth-brained false equivalency, devoid of historical context, that looks a little something like this. Mark Twain uses a racial slur in his writing. Racial slurs are used by racists to tear down minority groups in racist writings. Racists are bad. By the transitive property of equality, Mark Twain is bad. While the first 3 of those statements are true, the conclusion of equivalency is not. Slavery is, always has been, and always will be evil. But there were large and vocal groups of people who argued otherwise during the American Reconstruction and beyond. These reactionaries claimed there was an inherent inhumanity to those who had been freed as a result of the Civil War. So, how are we supposed to combat such thinking? Through understanding. In Huck Finn, we are forced to understand the injustice of Jim's circumstance by confronting his humanity on a visceral and personal level. Jim is a kind, well-meaning guy who has found himself in one of the worst possible scenarios anyone could find themselves in, solely as a result of his skin color. The point of his characterization is to show readers that he is like anybody else and deserves to be treated as such. Of course, these neolib types don't want to read into it so deeply. Instead, they want to show how cool and progressive they are by calling out the bad things. Personally, I think they're barking up the wrong tree. If they really wanted something to criticize, they should talk about Joe. In the book, Joe is evil. He is cruel for cruelty's sake, kills with no remorse, and tries to maim an old woman for a grudge he held against her dead husband before starving to death in a cave without any chance at humanity or redemption. He is considered to be a malicious outsider by both characters and author alike, and this is heavily implied to be as a result of his native heritage. For those who want to criticize Twain for racism, this is what they should talk about. Those types won't, though, because there's a good chance they don't remember it as being a problem. In greater American society, what we did to the native peoples of this continent might as well be considered as a forgotten genocide. We slaughtered our way from coast to coast and then tried to grind out any remaining vestiges of culture in the survivors. Hell, in Canada, they're still digging up bodies of children killed in native boarding schools in the 90s. You wouldn't expect to see someone in blackface if you were to go to a Halloween party. That would be considered wrong. But every Halloween party I went to in college had at least one drunk white chick dressed up as Pocahontas with no idea how problematic that was. Redface is f***ing everywhere, and so are racial stereotypes. No more so is this apparent than in the Adaptations of Tom Sawyer. The book doesn't have a villain in the modern sense. More a malicious, antagonistic force in the background of Tom and Huck's lives. There's never any real confirmation that Joe is hunting the boys. They're just afraid of him due to his penchant for violence and retaliation to petty slights. When adapting it to screen, though, something had to change. The Hollywood blockbuster is heavily formulaic, relying on tropes and visual shorthand to convey ideas to the broadest possible audience. Movies, especially those intended to be profitable, need to have a villain, so when Tom Sawyer was adapted to the big screen, Joe was transformed from malignant force to active antagonist. On the silver screen, Joe wants to murder Tom Sawyer for his role in getting Muff Potter acquitted. He follows Tom around, sneaks into Aunt Polly's house, and chases the boy through a cave before meeting his fateful demise in an epic showdown, usually by falling off a cliff. The sentiment, of course, is the same. These portrayals make Joe out to be irredeemable, but with the added component of putting a red face, to Joe's name in order to really drive home the racist overtures of the character. This type of depiction wasn't okay when Mark Twain wrote the book, or when any of these movies were made, and it definitely isn't okay now. It's gross, and I don't think people talk about it enough. Alright guys, there's one last adaptation of Tom Sawyer I wanted to talk about today, perhaps the most famous adaptation. I've sprinkled hints to it throughout the video so far for the eagle-eyed viewer, but for those of you who haven't noticed, I've been playing bits of a Rush song during the transitions. That's right. This whole video has been a ruse just to get you to this point. Welcome to my 3-hour presentation on why libertarianism is a failed political ideology. No, you can't stop me! Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. I'm gonna play us out, but I wanted to ask what you thought first. Have you seen any of these movies? Maybe I've reminded you of something from your childhood. Please, let me know in the comments down below. If you like what I do, I have more of it right here. Anyway. We all live on stolen land, doo-dah, doo-dah. Native blood is on our hands, oh-de-doo-dah-day. Oh-de-doo-dah-day, oh-de-doo-dah-day. Stole our plans, how is this okay? Thanks, guys. It is Tuesday. I am Tuesday. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.